already know everything costs more.
The cost of living has soared to its highest level in 33 years.
The consumer has a right to know why prices are going up.
There's little hope for price stabilization. Costs of transportation are steadily climbing.
But is that because of inflation or because corporations want to make a profit? And how separate are those two things anyway? The Bank of Canada and other central banks say corporations have been faster to increase their prices, and some say that's feeding into inflation. My colleague Pete Evans looked into this, so I called him up to understand more about what's going on. Hey, Pete.
Hey.
So what has the Bank of Canada noticed about corporate pricing strategies?
Basically just said they've noticed that companies aren't as afraid of raising their prices as they used to be.
Businesses have also changed the way they set prices for their goods and services, raising prices more often and by larger amounts.
So it's fascinating in that, we've had shocks to the economy on the demand side before. We've had gas prices go up. We've had shortages in certain materials. For the most part, you would just sort of swallow that to keep your customers happy, knowing that if you raise it too much, you would lose them.
This idea of making consumers pay for the extra cost of production, it's called cost pass-through. According to a Bank of Canada survey, even before the pandemic, most businesses were expecting their costs to rise. But the majority of them weren't going to increase their prices, meaning businesses were expecting to spend more. But instead of passing those costs on to consumers, they were okay taking the hit.
So let's take this temporary hit on the price of our delivery vans has gone up to fill up a tank by $20 every delivery. But instead of passing that on, let's just absorb that because we're worried that we might upset some of our customers, and therefore they might not call us next time. They might call the other guy who didn't raise their prices.
So what changed? Why were businesses suddenly okay with frequent price increases?
Markets tanking, businesses closing, shelves empty, the economic toll. Extensive coverage of the coronavirus pandemic.
The pandemic meant a lot of price increases, labor shortages, supply chain issues, and add on top of that natural disasters and war. In some places, you can actually see this playing out. This is the frequency of price increases and decreases in the UK. This shows how often companies were changing their prices. And between 2018 and 2020, it was relatively stable. Prices weren't changing that much. But after 2020, price increases started to become way more frequent. Price decreases, not so much. Costs went up everywhere. At the same time, demand for many goods and services also went up. And this time, companies could charge more because customers expected things to cost more.
Think about how we buy things. You have a sort of number in your mind for what a pair of jeans costs or a bottle of wine costs. And if you go into the store and you see the price is twice as high, you might go shop around somewhere else knowing I'm not going to pay that, I'm going to go there. So what this requires is the sort of consumer belief widespread that there are legitimate reasons. I've been hearing about it for months. The cost of energy has gone up. The cost of this has gone up. Once that switch has been turned on in our brains, it's really, really much easier for them to say, well, yeah, the price of this banana went up because it has to, and you don't sort of question it as much.
We were okay with paying more because we were tuned into the reasons why things cost more. It just seemed justified. So instead of absorbing extra costs like they had in the past, companies pass them on to the customers. And because you're paying more, companies get to maintain their profit margin. It might seem like higher costs are the result of inflation, but some economists say these pricing tactics are now actually driving inflation.
There's a lot of things that are factors in our current bout of high inflation, from supply and demand, monetary policy, the available of money that's out there, government spending, all that stuff is a factor. But in terms of corporate pricing, it's feeding into inflation because for the most part, a lot of those other factors in inflation have been dealt with. So all those very legitimate reasons for inflation have started to go away. But for some reason, corporations are still more than happy to keep raising their prices.
Some economists are using the term profit-led inflation. What does that mean?
So that's the $10 word for what we're talking about here. This is basically, as the name implies, it's when corporate profits are, instead of being at the end of the chain, they're in fact leading inflation, right? So companies are saying, we're going to run our business here. We have a profit margin after all of our costs are done. Now they're saying, well, our margin is 20%, so let's just raise our prices in case costs go up, and we'll protect it that way. So instead of prices going up being the result of something happening, it's now sort of driving the bus.
Right. The Bank of Canada won't say how much this is driving inflation, but other banks like the European Central Bank are more willing to put a number on it.
So by their math, basically 2/3 of the inflation in Europe in 2021 was caused by corporate pricing. Normally it's 1/3, and it sort of doubled functionally as a share of overall inflation. There's some data out of the US from the Kansas City Fed that showed something similar. The role of corporate profits was twice as much as it normally is in sort of factoring inflation.
So by not absorbing the costs the way they used to, corporations may be feeding into the cycle of inflation, keeping prices high. But we are seeing signs this is slowing down.
So finally, we've gotten to the good news portion of this. We are starting to see in the data that the sort of profit share of the overall unit cost is finally starting to come down. The numbers show corporate profits are starting to slow down, coming back to a much more normal level generally. And by extension, the amount of this profit-led inflation is starting to come back down to not normal, but it's well over the peak anyway.
We expect the economy to remain weak for the next few quarters, which means there's more downward pressure on inflation in the pipeline. In short, the excess demand in the economy that made it too easy to raise prices is now gone.
But a return to normal won't happen overnight. The head of the ECB says getting inflation under control will take a lot longer if corporations aren't willing to absorb some of the costs.
For this to happen, we need to ensure that firms absorb rising labor costs in margin.
So what can you do as a consumer in the meantime?
The power for consumers in this situation is where you can shop around. Just, be choosy about every dollar you spend, because every dollar you spend is being interpreted by, policymakers and central bankers, but also like accountants at companies to say, okay, well, yeah, let's raise the price of this can of beans by 10 cents and see what happens. If what they see is that they're selling more than 10% fewer cans of beans, they're going to try to adjust that soon. So I'm not going to put the burden on consumers to say, well, it's your job to shop around. And if, your rent goes up by $500, you should just move. But just sort of be aware that every dollar you're spending is a choice you're making, and it's a message that you're sending about your willingness to do it.
Make sure to check out the description below for our sources and more useful links on this topic.